Now, we've looked at some commencement speeches before. Time issued David Foster Wallace as the top in the top 10 commencement speeches. We looked at that. Steve Jobs. Well, let's take a look at Steve Jobs' commencement speech at Stanford University. Let's see if we can see something about how it's put together. First of all, some interesting things about this commencement speech. The rule of three. Well, we've seen that play out so many times before, especially in Obama's discourse. Repeat things 3 times. And you see it here as well. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about the varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of that. It means to try to tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means 3 times. Your time is limited, so don't waste, don't be trapped, don't let the noise of other opinions drown out your inner voice. And he repeats that one line 3 times. Stay hungry, stay foolish. That he repeats 3 times. There's sort of another thing that's going on here, and that is sort of the we call antithesis. Now, antithesis not in the sense of comparing across texts, but here in the sense of he dropped out, dropped in, dropped out, dropped in, looking forward, looking backwards, the heaviness, the lightness, the dead soon choices in life, death, life, old and new. So you have these contrasting pairs. Rule of 3, things compared, opposites contrasted. Here's the word cloud for the speech. Life, college. Well, he's going to tell us that he's going to present his speech in 3 stories. We're going to take a look at it. We're going to see how it plays out. This is the first story at the top. What do you think it's about? College. What about the second one here? Apple. And finally, death. Oh, it's a word cloud and it stands out because it's repeated, right? And so already you know that, yeah, his 3 stories, and they are going to be revolving around 3 ideas that are obviously apparent from the fact they are repeated with such frequency that they stand out here in the word cloud.
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it.
Follow along the text you have.
Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why did I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture. And I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all in the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
All right. Now, taking a look at this, well, if I'm analyzing the text, I would be looking at the process types. I haven't given you that information here, all right? So let me just, I'm going to share with you what my findings were. And I find that in this first story, 24% of it was relational, 56 was material, 13 mental, and 3% hardly at all verbal. Okay, let's keep going. Story 2.
My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out. and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still love what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love. And so I decided to start over. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next was at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Maureen and I have a wonderful family. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking, don't settle.
All right. Again, I took story 2 and I looked at the processes and so forth. More relational. Material about the same. Mental, slightly increased. No verbal processes. Story 3.
My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, if you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right. It made an impression on me. And since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no, for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment and failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know it to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything. You thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach, into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying. because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want. Everything else is second.
You'll notice that in this third story, there's much less material, much less doing. Well, obviously, it's about death. More relational, more obviously descriptive, some more in terms of verbal. Is this enough, though? Is it enough to just take a look at these process types? One thing that you can't help but notice as you read it, it's all very first person, right? Well, one of the things I always ask you to do when you're looking at a text is look at it within the context of situation in which that text is being given. What is the purpose of a commencement speech? Typically, a commencement speech is whoever is speaking, it's their story, which is meant to inspire you. It is meant to get a response from you. And you'll notice that as the text moves on and toward the end, it becomes more about you than about I. We'll take a note for that for a moment. But story one, I looked at where does I occur, story two, story three, and what I found was something interesting about the material processes. I is 33% of the doing is I. 20% in when he gets fired. 14% when he's going to have surgery. He doesn't have anything to do with himself. Nothing to do with it. We can see then that the nature of the story is going to be reflected in the choices of the process and his involvement in that process, the doing. He's the doer in the first story. Less so because he gets fired in the second story, and way much less so in the third story, where it's about name. Okay, what else am I going to look at? I'm going to look at sort of the usual simple versus complex clauses. First story, simple, 21%, 24, 17%. Complex clauses, quite a bit in the second story, especially. Hypotaxis, we notice, is very extensive, much more so than parataxis, which is what we expect from a text that is written, right? Obviously, it was written for me. But what makes it seem to be more, you get the feeling, I don't know if you felt that way, but even though he's reading it, you feel he's speaking. So what is there about the text that is giving us that feeling of as though he's telling us, he's talking to us. He's not just reading a text, okay, like a politician would, all right, giving their speech. He's not. That's quite different. Part of it, I think, will be in the use of parataxis, hypotaxis. We notice, especially the second story, it's almost half-half. All right, what would be the rhetorical structure? Well, we're not going to go through the whole rhetorical structure of this, but I'd like to go through the first story. The first story about connecting the dots. Well, that's what it's about. The rest of it is going to be elaborating on that point. I dropped out of Reed College and so forth and so on. When we take a look then at paragraph 8 and 9, 9 you'll notice is sort of the conclusion. Again, it's about connecting the dots. So it begins with connecting the dots, it ends with connecting the dots. And so we have the beginning, we have the end, but here in the this part here, how is it formed? Well, 3. How is the relationship between 3 and what follows? Well, you'll notice he asks a question. Very obvious solution. He's asking the question, and then he proceeds to give the answer. And so, very clearly, what is the relationship here? Question, the answer. Notice that between paragraph 4 and paragraph 5, at the end, someday go to college, and how does the next paragraph begin? And at 17 years later, I did go to college. Thematic progression, linear thematic progression, college at the end, mentioning it, that's what picks up in the next paragraph. Five and 6, 5. 17 years later, I did go to college, and here it sort of is the main idea. It was one of the best decisions. He uses that word best 3 times throughout this text. In each story, there's a best. And that best, I think, in some respects, is sort of that main idea, that nucleus, all right, which then is supported in what follows, 6 through 8. 6 through 8. How is 6 through 8? If you take a look at it, what would you take a look for a moment? Paragraph 6 through 8. Do you see any clues there? You see a clue at the end of paragraph 6? What is it? Let me give you an example. And so what follows here, 7 and 8, well, that's going to be the example. All right, let me give you an example. Then you have what follows up here. None of this had even a hope of practical application in my life. 10 years later, this I take to be the core idea, and this leading up to it, providing the background. I found it fascinating, but what was it actually that was so important about it? And that's mentioned in 8. Again, I'm trying to make the point. When you look at the coherence of a text, the signals, the more coherent that text is, and the more it has been written for you, the reader, to know how to piece it all together, the more signals are going to be there. Signals in terms of the choices of what is cohesive about those spans that make up the text. How do you identify the parts? Cohesiveness. How do those parts fit together? That's going to give you the coherence. And there's going to be the signals in terms of choices of theme, thematic progression. Those are all going to show you the method of development of the text. Last thing before I let you go for the break. I looked at the occurrences of you, and you'll notice from paragraph 15 onwards, you'll notice more, and it builds up in terms of you, where he is moving in the direction of he's addressing you. This is the story, not just personal, but to be addressed to you, to motivate you, to inspire you. Well, this is what I'm going to be asking you to take a look at for the mock test. We'll take a break. What I suggest is you can take a break. And when you come back, I'll give you the time up until all around 9:30 or so. All right. Now again, remember what I'm wanting you to do with this. I'm wanting you, because you're going to do this on the exam. What is your strategy? How are you going to approach answering that question? You have the data, same sort of kinds of analyses you will have in your exam, as we've been looking at throughout the course. What's your strategy? What are you going to look for? All right, so let's take a break, and when you come back, would you please carry on to work on it and say roughly around 9:30, maybe a little bit before that. Great. All right. Okay.